This is called The Boy Who Plaited Manes. The boy arrived, fittingly enough, on the day of the midsummer hunt. Into the stables, everything was chaos. Grooms were running, polishing saddles and brushing horses. Though Lord Robley was a petty lord, he demanded that everything in his stable and his retinue be perfect. The boy walked into the stable and into the stall of his young wife, Lady Eileen's white palfrey, and he began to plait its mane. Now the head groom, Wald, came by at a rush, and he stopped, and he was about to yell at the boy and ask why he was here. And then he saw his hands. He was plaiting a braid with each hand, and the horse stood as still as a stone for him, and he plaited them down to 3 hairs. He didn't tie off, he just pressed them together. And the hairs on the back of Wald's neck began to prickle. He had plaited many horses' braids, and he knew how the hair had a life of its own and would spring away from you. And the boy took these down and down, 1,000 little braids, and shaped them into a curious horsehair rose at the end. Wald wanted to order him out, but more he wanted the praise from his lord. So he sent all the other grooms who would stop to watch and marvel. He sent them all back to work. He took the cover off the lady's horse's tail, which had been bundled up to keep it clean, and said, "See what you can do with that." The boy's fingers fairly twitched to get at it, and he began to braid the horse's tail. He started up at the bone and took it down to tiny braids and left the rest flowing free. When the Lady Aileen saw it, she cried out with delight, for she was nobly born and used to fine things. And that day, Lord Robley's hawk flew badly, and his hounds were unruly, and his hunter stumbled, but it did not matter. For all eyes were on his beautiful young wife with her golden curls, and the horse's mane and tail matched the lace at her breast, and he knew that he was the envy of every man there. It took less than a day to go from being grateful to being greedy, and he sent ribbons in his colors, and he sent silver bells, so that at the end of every braid there was a little bell, and everywhere his lady rode there was the sweetest chiming. And it was not enough that her horse's mane should be plaited. His had to be too. He had a fiery hunter, but it stood still under the boy's hand, and he made a great crest along the neck and braided the top of the tail. It was magnificent. And then not just he and his lady, but their friends, their closest ones, their horses' manes must be braided, though not to a high degree. And if the Lady Elaine decided to go riding, her friends' horses' manes were braided too. And the boy who plaited manes asked for nothing. He slept in the straw, and he would have shivered in the cold had not one of the grooms tossed him a horse blanket. He stood once a day with his bowl for food, and he never spoke. "Why does he not speak?" said Wald. "Clearly he can hear. Is he somebody's half-witted son or bastard?" And he irritated him all the more, and the boy never came for the few pennies due him for his work. Wald kept them himself and hated him even more that he was obliged to him. Summer gave way to fall, and there were no more flowers to drape into the horses' manes, but feathers of a partridge and bright-colored straw, dried straw flowers. And every time he did it, the results were exquisite. And then winter came. The lady hated winter. At least in summer, there were walks to take, and you could go riding. There were people to impress. But in the winter, all she had was her embroidery, and looking in her mirror and looking at her skin, her hair, for she knew that was her one currency. She was one of her lord's most prized possessions, but if she lost this, she was lost indeed. She had married well enough for the younger daughter of a lord. She had had her fill, but not really her fill of dancing and flirtation, and now there was just this long winter. And then the woman who did her hair fell ill with smallpox, for that is what comes in the winter. And Lady Aileen looked and came to know that none of her other ladies in waiting had any talent for hair. And as she looked at her hair hanging down, she said, "By God, the boy who plats the horses' manes could do better. In fact, send him to me." And her ladies in waiting ran down, and they sent one of the kitchen maids out to the stable, and they brought back the shivering waif. Oh, and the smell of him, he could not go into the ladies' chamber like that. A basin of hot water was brought, and the boy was told to strip. And some of the ladies ran away, and others stayed. And they made sure that he scrubbed himself and washed his hair, and they looked at those great gray eyes under that black mop of hair. But he did as he was told. And they found him some servant's clothes that nearly fit. And when he was clean, he was taken up to the lady. She was waiting at her dressing table, and her long golden hair was behind her. And the boy did not bow. He did not speak a word, but his hands could not wait to touch that hair. And he weighed it in his hand. It was so fine. It was so silky, much better than the horse's hair. And he began to plait the lady's hair. And she sat as still as the horses under those hands. He was so gentle. Perhaps she had known gentleness once from her mother, but certainly never from a man. Lord Robley was a harsh man who took what he wanted and held it until he was done with it. But this was clearly a man's touch. And he started at the temple, and he braided her hair up to the top and took it down, and he put some of the pearls in it, and he turned and left. And he did not ask if she was pleased, for he knew she would be. And he came back the next day, and the next, and the ladies in waiting found him a place to sleep in the castle so that they did not have to bathe him every day. And every day he did her hair a different way. And each time it was as if it was the only way the hair could ever be styled, and nothing had been so poignant and so heartbreakingly beautiful. And finally, when Lord Robley went away to subdue a rebellious vassal, the lady knew what she must do. And she sent her maids away on a long, long errand. And when the boy who plaited manes came, and he had done her hair into yet another heartbreakingly beautiful style, and he turned to go, she grabbed his wrist. For if her own hair was entranced by this boy, how could she be otherwise? And she led him to her curtained bed and bid him disrobe. And he did what he was bid, and surprisingly manful for such a slim, slight fellow. And he was gentle. His hands, his mouth, she had never known such gentleness. And when he was done, he got dressed. And with a half smile on his face, he turned to her and said, "Swine, all you nobles are swine," and left. And the lady was hurt, and she was frightened. For it is one thing to take a mute lover, but to have someone who could betray you, it was more than she could bear. But he did not betray her. It was her own ladies in waiting who puzzled over the long, long errand, even though he was such a slight boy. He was like he could have been 10 or 17 or older, something wrong with him that kept him from a beard. They had seen the light in those eyes. They had seen the fire behind them, and they gossiped with the kitchen maids. And the kitchen maids gossiped with the stable hands, and that's how word of it came to Wald, the head groom. He thought, "I can be rid of the boy and all this falderal in my stables with one blow." And so when Lord Robley came home, he bid him to give him a few moments of conversation, and he told his lord what he suspected. Now, Lord Robley knew pettiness when he heard it, and he had often used it in the past. But when he went up to his lady, he did not even need to ask, for her hair was long and lank, and she could not meet his eyes, and he pulled out his sword and he slashed her across the face. And he left her crying and burning the cuts with her tears. And he stormed down to the stable with his sword still drawn with her blood on it. And the boy was in the stall of the white palfrey, plaiting its hair into roses and leaves and a fine net. And Lord Robley came in and drew the sword and chopped off the beast's head. And he would have killed the boy, had the boy cringed or run or turned, but he just stood there and looked at him. And he stood and looked at him with the point of the sword at the base of his neck, and Lord Robley could only think to tell his men to take the boy and throw him in the dungeon. And they took him down far below the castle, in a dark, dark dungeon, and they put him in there. There was a bed of straw, but there were shackles, but his hands and wrists, his feet, they were too thin for it. And the boy lay on the pallet, and he looked up at the tiny barred window way near the ceiling, and he waited. And when the moon rose, the moonbeams came in through the window, and the boy almost smiled, and he stood up and he began to pull down the rays of the moon and braid them and plait them with each hand until he had a great mound of woven moonbeams. And then he let the moon pass on, and he lay and he waited expectantly for sunrise. Now, it was almost noon when the sun was able to come through that little barred window, but the boy was ready. And he stood up and he pulled down the sun and he plaited the rays of the sun. Now, there were more guards around in the daytime than the night. And they came and they looked through the tiny window, and they could see the great pile of braided moonbeams, and they could see him pulling down the sun, and his hands were red with the sun behind them, but it did not burn him. And the guards told the head guard, and the head guard looked, and he went and got the steward, and when the steward had looked, he went up and got Lord Robley. And Lord Robley had not yet finished mutilating his wife, but he came down with the sword, intending to run the boy through. And he had the door to his cell opened, but when he looked in, the boy had fashioned a cloak silver on the outside and gold on the inside. But to call it silver and gold is an injustice. It was like light and flow, and all along the edges where they came together, there were little sparkles of light. It was a cloak, he thought, fit for a king, fit for an emperor, and he had to have it. And he grabbed the cloak and he twirled it around his shoulders, and he began to scream, as he had not yet made his young wife scream, and one long, loud scream, and he fell down dead. The boy who plaited manes looked down at the body, and he picked up the cloak, and he twirled it around his own shoulders, and it did him no harm. And he walked out of the cell, and all the guards plastered themselves against the wall, and no one tried to stop him. And he walked up into the castle, and out of the door, and into the yard, and out of the gate. And he had the air of someone whose job is done. And he walked out of the gate, and no one saw him again in that castle. Wald, the head groom, died young in his sleep from terrible nightmares every night that had weakened his heart. Of the Lady Ailinn we don't know, no story tells of her. And no one knows what happened to the boy who plaited manes, unless you believe the children, who say that on a stormy night they look and they see him riding the clouds, and he's plaiting the lashes of rain and wind and lightning together.